At its peak, Denmark ruled an empire stretching from Greenland to England, from Norway to the Baltic Islands. Today, it's smaller than West Virginia. Yet somehow, this tiny nation consistently ranks as the happiest country on Earth. The numbers are staggering. Denmark has lost roughly 70% of its historical territory over the past 5 centuries. It endured 300 years of Viking expansion, built and lost a North Sea empire, survived the Kalmar Union's collapse, weathered devastating wars with Sweden and Prussia, and suffered 5 years of Nazi occupation. How does a nation lose so much yet gain so much happiness? Join me as we explore 1,100 years of Danish history to uncover this remarkable transformation. Long before Vikings terrorized European coasts, long before any kingdom called Denmark existed, the land between the North Sea and the Baltic was home to hardy survivors who adapted to one of Europe's most challenging environments. Around 10,500 BCE, as the last ice sheets retreated northward, small bands of Mesolithic hunters tracked reindeer herds across a landscape still connected to Britain by dry land. These earliest inhabitants left behind flint tools and the bones of their meals, evidence of a mobile existence following game through birch forests and across open tundra. They hunted elk and wild boar, fished in cold streams, and gradually, generation by generation, learned to thrive in this harsh northern world. By 4000 BCE, the warming climate had transformed the region entirely. Rising seas swallowed the land bridges, creating the distinctive peninsula and island geography that would later define Denmark. Agriculture arrived from the south, brought by Neolithic farmers who cleared forests for their crops and herds. These were Denmark's first permanent settlers, communities who stayed in one place long enough to bury their dead beneath massive stone monuments. Thousands of these passage graves still dot the landscape today, silent testament to an organized society capable of moving stones weighing many tons. The Bronze Age, beginning around 1700 BCE, saw the emergence of something resembling religious belief that we can actually glimpse. Elaborate burial mounds rose across the land, containing wealthy individuals interred with bronze weapons, jewelry, and mysterious artifacts like the Trundholm sun chariot, a golden disc mounted on a wheeled bronze horse, suggesting sophisticated sun worship. Trade routes stretched south to the Mediterranean and east into Russia, bringing copper and tin to be worked by skilled craftsmen. Then came the Roman Empire's expansion northward. While Roman legions never conquered the Danish peninsula, their presence transformed the region nonetheless. Roman coins, pottery, and glassware flowed northward in exchange for furs, amber, and slaves. Germanic tribes inhabiting the region, the ancestors of the Danes, learned of Roman military tactics and political organization. They observed, they traded, and they absorbed. The migration period, beginning in the 4th century CE, witnessed massive population movements across Europe. Tribes shifted, merged, and vanished entirely. In Denmark, archaeological evidence suggests the land actually depopulated significantly during this era. Many inhabitants joined the Great Migration southward and westward, seeking fortune in the collapsing Roman territories. Yet some remained, and from these survivors emerged the distinct tribal groups who would claim the name Danes. By the 7th century, a recognizable Danish identity was forming in places like Læsø in Zealand, where later legends would place the halls of legendary kings. The stage was set for the dramatic transformation that would soon follow, when these scattered tribes would unite under powerful rulers and explode onto the European scene with devastating force. On June 8, 793, Monks at the monastery of Lindisfarne witnessed ships unlike any they had seen before cutting through the North Sea mist. The longships, with their distinctive curved prows and shallow drafts, beached on the Holy Island shore. What followed shocked Christian Europe to its core. Warriors poured from the vessels, slaughtering monks, seizing treasures, and burning buildings before vanishing back across the waves. The Viking Age had begun, and Denmark would lead it. These raiders were not mindless barbarians, though their victims certainly saw them that way. Danish Vikings were sophisticated seafarers who had perfected ship design over generations, creating vessels capable of crossing oceans yet shallow enough to navigate rivers deep into continental Europe. Their longships, propelled by both sail and oar, could strike anywhere, retreat before organized resistance could form, and return home laden with silver, gold, and captives. The attacks intensified rapidly. Danish fleets descended upon Francia repeatedly, exploiting the fractured Carolingian Empire's inability to defend its sprawling coastlines and river systems. In 845, a fleet of 120 Viking ships sailed up the Seine River toward Paris. The city's defenders watched helplessly as the Danes surrounded them, establishing a siege that would end only when Charles the Bald paid 7,000 pounds of silver for their departure. This wasn't warfare as Europeans understood it. This was business. The Danes had discovered that threatening violence could be just as profitable as actual violence. But Denmark's ambitions extended beyond quick raids and ransoms. In 865, a massive force called the Great Heathen Army landed in England, intent not on raiding but conquest. Led by legendary warriors whose names still echo through history, Eivor the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson among them, this wasn't a raiding party but an invasion force. Over the next 14 years, they systematically dismantled 3 of England's 4 kingdoms. Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia fell to Danish swords and battle axes. Only Wessex, under Alfred the Great, managed to resist. The resulting compromise created the Danelaw, a vast territory in northern and eastern England where Danish law, customs, and language dominated. Towns with names ending in by and thorpe sprouted across the landscape, permanent Danish settlements that would shape England's character forever. Danish farmers worked English soil. Danish traders established markets. A hybrid culture emerged, neither fully English nor fully Danish, but something entirely new. Back in Scandinavia, wealth from these conquests transformed Danish society. Hedeby, located near modern Germany's border, exploded into one of Northern Europe's most important trading centers. Merchants from across the known world converged on this bustling port, exchanging Frankish wine, Byzantine silk, and Arabic silver for Scandinavian furs, amber, and slaves. The town's defensive ramparts protected not just raiders returning with plunder, but legitimate merchants conducting sophisticated international trade. This was Denmark's golden age of expansion when Danish warriors and traders ranged from Greenland to Constantinople, leaving their mark on every shore they touched. Yet this very success would soon force a reckoning. Could Denmark remain a loose collection of tribal territories united only by culture and temporary alliances? Or would the wealth and power concentrated through raiding and trading create something new? A unified kingdom capable of standing among Europe's great powers? The answer would come from within, as ambitious leaders recognized that true power required more than swift ships and sharp swords. Harald Bluetooth inherited a realm in 958 that existed more in theory than reality. Danish territories stretched across Jutland, the islands, and parts of southern Scandinavia, but local chieftains ruled their own domains with minimal oversight. Harald understood that Denmark's future depended not on loose confederations of warriors, but on centralized power enforced through both military might and something Denmark had never possessed: religious legitimacy. His first task was practical and brutal. Across Denmark, Harald ordered the construction of 4 massive ring fortresses at Trelleborg, Agersborg, Fyrkat, and Nannebakken. These weren't crude earthworks, but sophisticated military installations, each built to identical geometric specifications. Perfectly circular ramparts protected barracks arranged in precise quadrants. The symmetry was stunning, the engineering revolutionary. These fortresses served dual purposes: projecting royal power into previously independent regions while housing professional warriors loyal to Harald rather than local lords. But Harald knew fortresses alone couldn't transform Denmark into a legitimate kingdom. Europe's established powers derived authority not just from swords but from the church. The Old Norse gods who had served Danish raiders so well offered no diplomatic bridges to Christian courts. Harald needed those bridges. His father Gorm had resisted Christianity until death, but Harald saw what his father could not. Denmark's future lay within Christendom, not outside it. The conversion came sometime around 960. Accounts differ on whether Harald experienced genuine spiritual awakening or calculated political advantage. Perhaps both motivated him. What matters is that Harald didn't simply accept Christianity privately. He proclaimed it publicly, forcefully, permanently. He demolished the pagan burial mounds at Jelling, Jutland's ancient religious center, and rebuilt the site as Christianity's foothold in Denmark. At Jelling, Harald commissioned 2 massive runestones that still stand today. The larger stone, often called Denmark's birth certificate, declares in runic script, King Harald ordered this monument made in memory of Gorm, his father, and in memory of Thyra, his mother. That Harald who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. The stone's carved image shows Christ crucified, Denmark's first known depiction of Christian iconography. This wasn't merely a memorial. This was propaganda carved in stone, announcing to every visitor that Denmark had joined Europe's community of Christian nations. Churches began rising across Denmark's landscape. Timber structures at first, modest by continental standards, but their presence marked revolutionary change. The old ways, the sacrifices to Odin and Thor, faced systematic dismantling. Harald didn't wait for gradual acceptance. Local chieftains who resisted Christianity found themselves facing royal fortresses and armed retainers. Conversion became synonymous with submission to royal authority. Denmark's spiritual transformation and political unification proceeded together, 2 sides of Harald's grand design. Yet Harald's heavy-handed methods bred resentment, particularly from his own family. His son Sweyn, later called Forkbeard, watched his father demolish traditions that had sustained Danish identity for centuries. The tension erupted into open rebellion around 986. Sweyn, leading disaffected nobles who chafed under Harald's centralization, raised an army against his father. Father and son met in battle, and Harald suffered a fatal wound, likely from an arrow. Sweyn's rebellion succeeded, but he inherited his father's unified kingdom. The fortresses remained. The churches stood. The gelling stones proclaimed Denmark's Christian identity to all who could read them. Harald had transformed Denmark irreversibly. No future king could return to the fragmented tribal territories that existed before 958. Denmark had become a kingdom, in fact, not just name, with the institutions and international recognition to prove it. Sweyn Forkbeard would use this inheritance to launch Denmark toward even greater ambitions, but that was possible only because Harald had built the foundation. Viking Denmark was ending. Medieval Denmark was rising from its ashes. Sweyn Forkbeard came to power through patricide, having driven his father Harald to a fatal battlefield wound. But if Danish nobles expected the rebellious son to abandon his father's centralizing vision, they badly misjudged their new king. Sweyn possessed Harald's ambition multiplied tenfold, and he added something his father lacked: a burning desire to restore Danish dominance over England's wealthy kingdoms. The timing was perfect. England under Ethelred II, later called the Unready, had grown complacent. The great payments of Danegeld, tribute meant to buy peace from Viking raiders, had stopped flowing to Scandinavia. English defenses had atrophied, and Sweyn possessed something earlier raiders never had: a unified Danish kingdom capable of sustained military campaigns rather than seasonal raids. The attacks began in the 990s. Danish fleets descended on England's coast with renewed ferocity, but these weren't random pillaging expeditions. Sweyn coordinated systematic strikes against strategic targets, withdrawing before English forces could respond effectively. Each raid extracted more treasure, more slaves, more humiliation. Ethelred responded with gold, reviving the Danegeld payments. Danish warriors returned home wealthy, and Sweyn's treasury swelled. But gold alone couldn't buy lasting security. English resentment simmered beneath each forced payment. That resentment exploded on November 13th, 1002, a day remembered as the Bryce's Day Massacre. Ethelred, desperate to rid England of Danish settlers who might aid future invasions, ordered their mass execution. Across England, mobs descended on Danish communities. Men, women, children, none were spared. Among the victims was Gunhilda, sister to Sweyn Forkbeard himself. The massacre transformed Sweyn's campaigns from profitable raids into personal vendetta. He would accept nothing less than England's total subjugation. For the next decade, Danish forces ravaged English territories with methodical brutality. Wessex burned. Mercia bled. East Anglia collapsed. Ethelred's government proved incapable of mounting effective resistance. English nobles, watching their king fail repeatedly, began questioning why they should remain loyal to such incompetence. In 1013, Sweyn launched his final campaign. This time he came not to raid, but to conquer. His fleet landed in northern England, where Danish settlement remained strong. The Danelaw territories welcomed him as liberator rather than invader. From there, Sweyn marched south, and resistance crumbled before him like rotten timber. One by one, England's regions submitted. Winchester fell. Oxford surrendered. London itself, England's greatest city, opened its gates. By Christmas 1013, Ethelred had fled to Normandy. Sweyn Forkbeard stood as undisputed king of all England, the first Danish ruler to claim that title. The Viking threat that had haunted England for 2 centuries had finally achieved its ultimate victory. Danish power now spanned the North Sea, controlling territories from Jutland to the Thames. It was the culmination of everything Sweyn had worked towards since deposing his father. Then, on February 3rd, 1014, barely 5 weeks after his triumph, Sweyn Forkbeard died suddenly. Contemporary sources offer conflicting accounts, some suggesting natural causes, others hinting at assassination. His death created immediate chaos. In England, Ethelred rushed back from exile, reclaiming his throne before Sweyn's forces could regroup. In Denmark, succession questions erupted. Sweyn's son Harald inherited Denmark proper, while another son, Cnut, found himself stranded in England with an army but no kingdom. The great North Sea empire Sweyn had built seemed destined to fragment as quickly as it had formed. But Canute, his father's son in ambition, if not in years, had no intention of surrendering England without a fight. Cnut was barely 20 years old when his father's sudden death left him commanding a Danish army on hostile English soil. The young prince faced a choice: retreat to Denmark where his older brother Harald ruled, or fight for the kingdom his father had briefly held. Cnut chose war. The conflict that followed proved brutal and inconclusive. Ethelred, restored to his throne but lacking resources, could barely maintain control. English nobles, exhausted by decades of warfare, began questioning whether continued resistance served any purpose. Then in April 1016, Ethelred died, passing England's crown to his son Edmund Ironside. The new king proved a formidable opponent, winning several battles against Danish forces. But England's strength was spent. After months of bloody stalemate, Edmund and Cnut met to negotiate. The Treaty of Alney divided England between them. Edmund would rule Wessex. Cnut would control everything north of the Thames. Neither man wanted this arrangement, but both armies needed respite. The compromise lasted precisely 1 month. Edmund died on November 30th, 1016, under circumstances historians still debate. With no strong successor, English nobles assembled and proclaimed Cnut king of all England. This time, the conquest would last. Cnut understood what his father hadn't grasped during his brief reign. Ruling England required more than military dominance. The young Danish king immediately set about transforming himself from foreign conqueror into legitimate English monarch. He married Emma of Normandy, Ethelred's widow, linking himself to English royal bloodlines while securing Norman neutrality. He retained English laws and customs, appointed English bishops and nobles to positions of authority, and generously funded English churches. When Danish warriors caused trouble, Cnut punished them as harshly as English criminals. The transformation worked. Within 5 years, England accepted Cnut not as occupier but as rightful king. His court at Winchester became a center of learning and culture. English chronicles written during his reign praised him as just pious and wise. The same kingdom that had resisted his father so fiercely now prospered under Danish rule. But England alone couldn't satisfy Cnut's ambitions. When his brother Harald died in 1018 or 1019, Cnut claimed Denmark's throne, uniting it with England under single rule for the first time. Then he turned north toward Norway. King Olaf Haraldsson had established himself as Norway's ruler, but his harsh enforcement of Christianity and heavy taxation alienated many Norwegian nobles. Cnut exploited this dissatisfaction, offering gold and promises to Norwegian chieftains. By 1028, Olaf fled into exile, and Cnut added Norway to his domains. The North Sea Empire was complete. From the Scottish borders to the Baltic Sea, it controlled territories no Scandinavian ruler had ever united. Danish fleets dominated northern waters. English silver filled Danish treasuries. Norwegian timber built English ships. The interconnected realm represented Viking ambition's ultimate achievement, but Cnut understood that military conquest meant nothing without diplomatic legitimacy. In 1027, he made pilgrimage to Rome, attending the coronation of Conrad II as Holy Roman Emperor. The journey served multiple purposes. Cnut negotiated reduced tolls for English merchants traveling through imperial territories. He secured favorable terms for English pilgrims visiting Rome. Most importantly, he presented himself as Christian monarch equal to any European ruler, receiving papal blessing and imperial recognition. The Viking king's grandson now moved among Europe's elite as respected peer rather than barbarian outsider. Yet, for all its apparent strength, Cnut's empire rested on his personal authority alone. He built no administrative infrastructure to outlast him, established no clear succession, created no institutional framework for governing such diverse territories. When Cnut died on November 12, 1035, aged approximately 40, the empire immediately began disintegrating. His sons Harald Harefoot and Harthacnut divided England and Denmark between them, then promptly fell into conflict. Norway expelled Danish governors within months. By 1042, when Harthacnut died suddenly at a wedding feast, the North Sea Empire had completely collapsed. England's crown passed to Edward the Confessor, Aethelred's son, restoring the old English royal line. The greatest Viking empire had lasted barely 7. The death of Harthacnut at that wedding feast in 1042 left Denmark without clear direction. While England reverted to Anglo-Saxon rule under Edward the Confessor, the Danish throne became a prize contested by multiple claimants, each wielding legitimate arguments and armed supporters. Magnus, the Good of Norway, arrived first. As Cnut's designated heir in Norway and claiming similar rights to Denmark, Magnus crossed the border with an army. Danish nobles, weakened by succession disputes and lacking unified leadership, offered little resistance. By 1042, Magnus controlled both Norway and Denmark, briefly reuniting 2/3 of Cnut's fallen empire. But his triumph proved short-lived. In 1047, Magnus died campaigning against Slavic tribes, leaving the question of succession more tangled than ever. Sweyn Estridsson, nephew of Cnut the Great through his mother Estrid, seized the opportunity. He claimed Denmark's throne not through conquest, but through blood, arguing that descent through Cnut's sister provided stronger legitimacy than Magnus's designation. Yet Harald Hardrada of Norway disputed this interpretation. The Norwegian king spent 15 years trying to enforce his claim on Denmark, launching repeated invasions that devastated the countryside without ever securing lasting victory. Sweyn proved impossible to defeat permanently, but equally unable to expel Norwegian forces. The grinding conflict finally ended in 1064 when both kings, exhausted by fruitless warfare, agreed to recognize each other's separate kingdoms. Sweyn Estridsson's reign established a new Danish dynasty, but it also established a poisonous precedent. Before dying in 1074 or 1076, Sweyn fathered at least 20 children with various women. He designated 5 of his sons as potential successors without clearly defining which held priority. The result was predictable catastrophe. For the next 80 years, Denmark descended into recurring civil war. Brothers fought brothers, cousins murdered cousins, and pretenders emerged from every corner of the realm. Harald ruled briefly before his brother Canute the Holy deposed him. When Canute attempted church reforms and new taxes, angry nobles killed him in Odense's St. Alban's Church in 1086. His brother Olaf Hunger took the throne amid famine so severe that Danes remembered it for generations. Eric the Evergood followed, then Niels, then each of their sons and nephews in bloody succession. The violence reached its horrifying climax on August 9th, 1057, at a feast in Roskilde. King Sweyn III, along with his rival claimants Canute Magnusson and Valdemar, gathered supposedly to negotiate peace. Instead, Sweyn's forces attacked during the meal itself, cutting down Canute and many followers in what became known as the Blood Feast of Roskilde. Even by Denmark's violent standards, this betrayal shocked contemporaries. But Sweyn miscalculated. Valdemar escaped the massacre and rallied support among nobles disgusted by such treachery. Within months, the 2 remaining claimants met in battle at Grathheath. Sweyn's forces broke and fled. The king himself died during the rout, reportedly drowned while attempting to cross a stream. At age 28, Valdemar I stood as Denmark's sole surviving king, having outlasted every rival through combination of military skill, political cunning, and remarkable fortune. The century of chaos was ending. Denmark's age of greatness was about to begin. Valdemar I inherited a kingdom exhausted by civil war, its fields trampled by rival armies, its nobility fractured by generations of bloodshed. Yet, within a decade, he would transform Denmark from a war-torn backwater into the dominant power of the Baltic Sea. His secret weapon was not military genius alone, but an extraordinary partnership with a brilliant churchman named Absalon. Absalon grew up alongside Valdemar, fostered in the same noble household. When Valdemar became king, he appointed his childhood friend as Bishop of Roskilde, then Archbishop. Together, they embarked on an ambitious program of conquest and consolidation. Absalon understood that military victories meant nothing without institutional support. He transformed the Danish church into an engine of royal power, building fortifications disguised as monasteries and training priests who served equally as administrators and royal agents. Their first target lay across the Baltic. The Wendish Slavs had raided Danish coasts for centuries, carrying off captives and plunder with impunity. In 1067, Absalon led a fleet against their strongholds, crushing their naval power in a series of brutal campaigns. That same year, he founded a small fishing village on the island of Zealand, fortifying it with a castle and declaring it protected harbor. He called the settlement København, Merchant's Harbor. Copenhagen had been born. The location proved brilliant. Positioned at the narrowest point of the Øresund, Copenhagen controlled maritime traffic between the Baltic and North Seas. What began as a military outpost grew rapidly into a trading hub, attracting German merchants, Hanseatic traders, and craftsmen from across northern Europe. By the 1300s, it would eclipse Roskilde as Denmark's true capital. Valdemar died in 1082, succeeded by his son Canute VI, who continued his father's expansionist policies. But the true architect of Danish dominance proved to be Valdemar II, crowned in 1202. Contemporaries called him Valdemar the Victorious, and for good reason. Under Valdemar II, Denmark reached its medieval zenith. His armies conquered Pomerania, Mecklenburg, and Holstein, pushing Danish influence deep into German territory. But his greatest triumph came in 1229, when Danish crusaders conquered Estonia. For the first time, Denmark controlled both shores of the Baltic Sea, dominating the lucrative east-west trade routes that connected Russian furs and timber with Flemish cloth and French wine. This Baltic empire generated enormous wealth. Valdemar used it to commission the magnificent brick churches that still define the Danish countryside. Red brick, fired in local kilns, became Denmark's architectural signature, replacing wood and thatch with imposing structures that proclaimed both Christian devotion and royal power. But empires built quickly often crumble faster. On May 14, 1223, while hunting in northern Estonia, Valdemar was kidnapped by Henry of Schwerin, a German nobleman resenting Danish expansion. The ransom was catastrophic: 45,000 marks of silver and surrender of all Danish conquests except Estonia and Rügen. Valdemar paid, but his empire had been mortally wounded. The final blow fell at Bornhoved in 1227. Determined to reclaim his lost territories, Valdemar assembled a massive army and invaded Holstein. German princes, terrified of Danish resurgence, united against him. The battle proved disastrous. Danish forces were routed, their Baltic empire shattered permanently. Valdemar II lived until 1241, but his dreams of Danish supremacy died at Bornhoved. The age of expansion had ended, yet he left behind something more lasting than conquered territory: a unified kingdom, a flourishing capital, and the legal code that would govern Denmark for 500 years. Valdemar II died in 1241, believing his son Eric would preserve what remained of Danish power. Instead, Eric IV, known as Plowpenny for his hated land tax, faced a nobility that had tasted opportunity during the Baltic Empire's collapse. They had no intention of surrendering their newfound autonomy. The nobles struck first in 1282, forcing Eric to sign a coronation charter that fundamentally reshaped Danish governance. This document, the first of many such constitutions, required the king to consult his nobles on matters of war, taxation, and law. Royal power, once nearly absolute under the Valdemars, now existed at the pleasure of aristocratic consensus. The Danish crown had become negotiable. Eric resented every clause. He spent his reign attempting to circumvent noble restrictions, levying creative new taxes and appointing loyal foreigners to key positions. The nobility watched, waited, and plotted. On November 22, 1286, their patience ended. While sleeping in a barn near Viborg, Eric was stabbed to death by unknown assassins. 9 noblemen were eventually charged, but their trial became a farce. The accused appeared with hundreds of armed retainers, intimidating judges and witnesses alike. All were acquitted. The message was unmistakable. Kings who defied noble power died quietly in barns, and their killers walked free. Eric's successors learned this lesson too well. Royal authority collapsed into paralysis as each new king signed away more powers, granted more privileges, surrendered more land. By 1320, Denmark resembled less a unified kingdom than a collection of competing principalities, each duke and count ruling his territory as an independent sovereign. Into this chaos stepped Count Gerhard of Holstein, a German nobleman whose ambitions far exceeded his modest title. The Danish kings, desperate for military support against rebellious vassals, had repeatedly borrowed enormous sums from Gerhard. Unable to repay, they offered collateral, castles, provinces, entire regions of Denmark itself. Gerhard accepted eagerly, transforming debt into dominion. By 1326, this German count effectively controlled more Danish territory than the Danish king. Gerhard held Zealand, Funen, Jutland's richest districts, and Copenhagen itself, all mortgaged for loans that could never be repaid. He installed German officials, collected Danish taxes, and administered Danish justice. Denmark had become a German protectorate in all but name. Then, in 1332, the unthinkable occurred. King Christopher II died without securing his son's succession. The nobles, fractured into competing factions and owing allegiance to various German princes, could not agree on a new monarch. For 8 years, Denmark had no king at all. These interregnum years saw the kingdom's nodder. German counts administered former Danish lands. Holstein nobles squabbled over provinces. Pirates infested the coasts unopposed. The union forged by the Valdemars, the empire built on Baltic dominance, the very concept of Denmark as a sovereign nation seemed finished. Yet, in 1340, a remarkable woman was preparing Denmark's resurrection. Valdemar IV was 18 years old when he arrived in Denmark in 1340, claiming a crown that barely existed. His mother, Duchess Ingeborg, had spent those 8 kingless years negotiating with German princes, Holstein counts, and Danish nobles who had grown comfortable without royal oversight. Her son inherited a kingdom that was 90% mortgaged to foreigners, a treasury containing literally nothing, and a nobility that viewed him as an inconvenient interruption to their autonomy. Most kings would have despaired. Valdemar saw opportunity. His contemporaries called him Atterdag, meaning, "There will be another day." Whether this reflected his optimism or simply became his motto by necessity, the name proved prophetic. Valdemar understood something his predecessors had forgotten. Denmark's weakness was also the weakness of those who controlled it. The German counts and Holstein princes squabbled constantly, each jealous of the other's Danish holdings. Valdemar would exploit every fracture. He began with strategic patience. Rather than demanding territories be returned, he negotiated, offering to formalize German holdings in exchange for recognition as Denmark's legitimate king. The Germans, eager for legal confirmation of their conquests, agreed. Valdemar now had what he needed most: time and legitimacy. Next came money. Valdemar imposed every tax his treasury could imagine, squeezing revenue from peasants and townsmen while carefully exempting the nobility whose support he required. He borrowed from merchants, pledged future revenues, and sold privileges to anyone who would pay. Every coin went toward a single purpose: buying back Denmark piece by piece. In 1346, he repurchased his first castle. Then another. Then a province. The Germans, confident in their dominance, assumed these transactions were temporary arrangements. they failed to notice the pattern until too late. By 1350, Valdemar controlled Zealand again. By 1355, Funen. The mortgage holders, divided and distracted by their own conflicts, discovered they had sold Denmark back to the Danes. But Valdemar wanted more than restoration. In 1361, he turned his gaze toward Gotland, the wealthy Baltic island that controlled trade between Russia and Western Europe. Gotland belonged to Sweden technically, though its capital Visby operated as a virtually independent Hanseatic city. Its merchants grown fat on commerce they barely taxed. Valdemar invaded with overwhelming force. Visby's merchants, unaccustomed to actual warfare, marched out wearing gilded armor over their merchant robes, treating the battle like some ceremonial pageant. Danish veterans slaughtered them systematically. When Visby surrendered, Valdemar demanded 3 enormous barrels be filled with gold and silver as ransom. The city complied. Denmark was not just restored, it was wealthy again. The Hanseatic League could not tolerate this precedent. These German merchant cities had grown powerful by operating outside royal control, playing kingdoms against each other while monopolizing Baltic trade. A strong Denmark threatened everything. In 1362, they declared war. The conflict lasted 8 years. Danish ships burned Hanseatic merchants. German fleets raided Danish coasts. Neither side could achieve decisive victory, but Denmark's treasury emptied fighting the League's combined commercial might. In 1370, Valdemar accepted a humiliating peace, granting Hanseatic merchants extensive trade privileges throughout Denmark. He had saved his kingdom but could not secure its future. Valdemar died in 1375, having restored Danish sovereignty and territorial integrity through sheer determined will. Yet he left no surviving sons, only daughters whose claims would entangle Denmark in Nordic politics for decades to come. The question now became whether Denmark's resurrection would survive its resurrector's death. Valdemar's daughter Margaret was only 6 years old in 1363 when her father married her to King Hakon of Norway. The marriage was politics, pure calculation, binding together 2 Nordic kingdoms through a child bride who had no say in the arrangement. Nobody expected this girl would become the most powerful monarch Scandinavia had ever seen. Margaret was 18 when her father died, leaving Denmark without a clear heir. The Danish nobility elected her infant son Olaf as king, with Margaret serving as regent and guardian. This should have made her merely a caretaker, a temporary administrator until the boy came of age. But Margaret understood power better than most men twice her experience. When Norwegian nobles simultaneously elected Olaf as their king following Hakon's death in 1380, she controlled 2 kingdoms through her son's dual crowns. She governed brilliantly. While technically acting on Olaf's behalf, Margaret negotiated treaties, appointed officials, and consolidated royal authority with ruthless efficiency. She reclaimed crown lands that nobles had appropriated during Denmark's chaotic decades, using legal pressure and strategic marriages rather than warfare. The nobility grumbled but complied. This woman possessed her father's determination wrapped in diplomatic sophistication he had never managed. Then in 1387, 17-year-old King Olaf died suddenly. No explanation satisfied the whispers. Poison? Disease? The cause mattered less than the consequence. Margaret had no other children, no obvious heir, no legal basis for continued rule. What happened next was unprecedented. The Danish and Norwegian nobility formally recognized Margaret not as regent or guardian, but as their sovereign ruler. They called her plenipotentiary lady and rightful master, carefully avoiding the word queen, which implied a ruling husband but granting her absolute royal authority nonetheless. A woman now ruled 2 kingdoms in her own right, not through son or husband, but through sheer political necessity and respect. Margaret immediately turned towards Sweden. That kingdom had descended into chaos under German King Albert of Mecklenburg, whose favoritism toward German nobles had alienated Sweden's native aristocracy. Swedish opposition leaders invited Margaret to intervene, offering her Sweden's crown if she would liberate them from Albert's rule. In 1389, Margaret's forces met Albert's army at Osel in southern Sweden. The battle was brief and decisive. Albert was captured, imprisoned, and eventually forced to renounce his Swedish claims. Margaret now controlled Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, the first ruler to unite all Scandinavia under a single sovereign. But Margaret wanted permanence, not personal achievement. She adopted her great-nephew Eric of Pomerania as heir, ensuring succession beyond her lifetime. In 1397, she summoned nobility from all 3 kingdoms to the Swedish town of Kalmar for an extraordinary ceremony. There, Eric was crowned King of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden simultaneously, while Margaret remained the true power behind his throne. The Kalmar Union, as it became known, represented Margaret's vision for Nordic cooperation under Danish leadership. The 3 kingdoms would maintain separate laws and customs, but share foreign policy, defense, and a common monarch. It was sophisticated statecraft, attempting to balance unity with autonomy, strength with flexibility. She spent her remaining years consolidating this achievement, traveling constantly between her 3 kingdoms, adjudicating disputes, appointing loyal administrators, and gradually asserting royal control over nobles who had grown too independent. Her methods were subtle but effective, using law and bureaucracy rather than armies, building institutions that would outlast any single ruler. Margaret died in 1412 aboard a ship in Flensburg Harbor, still traveling between her kingdoms at age 59. She had ruled for 25 years, longer than most kings, transforming Scandinavian politics through determination and diplomatic brilliance that made military conquest unnecessary. The Kalmar Union she created would survive, though increasingly strained, for another century. But her true legacy was demonstrating that gender need not limit leadership. In an age when women were expected to obey fathers, husbands, and sons, Margaret I had ruled 3 kingdoms, commanded armies, and reshaped Northern European politics through sheer capability. Denmark now faced a new question. Could Eric of Pomerania maintain what his great-aunt had built? Eric of Pomerania inherited Margaret's 3 kingdoms, but none of her political instincts. The young king, crowned at 13 but only assuming real power after Margaret's death in 1412, immediately demonstrated why bloodline and capability rarely coincide. Where Margaret had understood compromise and patience, Eric saw only royal prerogative. Where she had built consensus, he issued demands. His obsession was war with Holstein and the Hanseatic League, those German merchant cities controlling Baltic trade. Eric wanted to strengthen Danish control over the Sound, the narrow strait between Denmark and Sweden, where every ship passing between the North Sea and Baltic could be taxed. It was sound economic strategy, but terrible politics. To fund his ambitions, Erik imposed crushing taxes across all three kingdoms. Swedish and Norwegian nobility, who had accepted Margaret's authority because she governed wisely, saw no reason to bankrupt themselves for a king fighting German wars that benefited mainly Denmark. By 1434, Sweden had erupted in open rebellion. A minor nobleman named Engelbrekt Engelbrektsson led miners and peasants in attacks against royal castles and officials. This was not aristocratic posturing, but genuine popular uprising. Swedish commoners, crushed by Erik's taxes and enraged by his appointment of Danish and German administrators to Swedish positions, rallied behind Engelbrekt with pitchforks and mining tools. Erik's response was characteristic. He ignored the crisis until military force became necessary, then applied it incompetently. Engelbrekt's forces controlled most of Sweden by 1435. Though Engelbrekt himself was murdered the following year, possibly by rivals within the Swedish nobility, the rebellion he ignited never truly ended. Sweden had tasted independence from Danish authority and found it preferable. In 1439, the Danish nobility had endured enough. They deposed Erik, replacing him with his nephew Christopher of Bavaria. When Christopher died childless just 9 years later, the Union's fundamental weakness became undeniable. Each kingdom now elected its own monarch. Denmark and Norway chose Christian of Oldenburg, a German count with family connections but no impressive credentials. Sweden selected Karl Knutsson, a native nobleman. The Kalmar Union existed only on parchment. Christian I, founding the Oldenburg dynasty that would rule Denmark for 4 centuries, proved surprisingly capable. He could not reunite the three kingdoms permanently, but he strengthened Danish control over Schleswig and Holstein in the south, creating problems that would haunt Denmark for 400 years but securing valuable territory. His descendants continued claiming Sweden, occasionally achieving temporary control, but Swedish nationalism had awakened. Then came Christian II, and with him came blood. Christian I became king in 1513, inheriting Danish and Norwegian crowns and immediately fixating on conquering Sweden. By 1520, after years of warfare, he had succeeded. Swedish resistance leader Sten Sture the Younger died in battle, and Stockholm surrendered. Christian promised amnesty, reconciliation, and fair treatment. On November 8, 1520, Christian invited Swedish nobility to a reconciliation banquet in Stockholm. Over 3 days, he systematically arrested and executed 82 people: bishops, nobles, prominent citizens. The Stockholm bloodbath, as it became known, was calculated terror designed to eliminate Swedish leadership permanently. It achieved the opposite. A young Swedish nobleman named Gustav Vasa, whose father died in the massacre, escaped and fled north. Over the following months, he rallied peasants and miners, the same groups Engelbrekt had mobilized nearly a century earlier. Swedish nationalism, already strong, became irresistible. By 1523, Gustav Vasa's forces had driven Christian from Sweden. On June 6th, Swedish nobility elected Gustav their king. The Kalmar Union was finished, shattered by Christian brutality. Denmark had entered the 16th century controlling Scandinavia. Now it faced a newly independent Sweden and a king whose atrocities had turned even Danish nobility against him. Christian ID's reign would not last much longer, and Denmark would need to reimagine its place in Northern Europe. Christian IG brutality had disgusted everyone, including his own Danish nobility. In 1523, as Gustav Vasa consolidated Swedish independence, Danish aristocrats and bishops forced Christian to flee. They offered his throne to his uncle, Frederick I, Duke of Holstein, on one condition: he must respect their privileges and traditional authority. The age of absolute royal power in Denmark was temporarily over. Frederick I was cautious, politically astute, and deeply aware that he ruled only because nobles allowed it. He was also quietly sympathetic to the religious revolution sweeping through Germany. A monk named Martin Luther had challenged Catholic authority just 6 years earlier, and his ideas spread like wildfire across Northern Europe. Luther argued that Christians needed no priestly intermediaries, that faith alone secured salvation, that the Bible should be available in languages people actually spoke rather than locked in Latin. These ideas reached Denmark through merchants, students, and seafarers. By 1525, Lutheran preachers operated openly in Danish cities, particularly Copenhagen. Frederick I officially remained Catholic, but he practiced strategic tolerance. When Catholic bishops demanded he suppress Lutheran heretics, Frederick demurred. Denmark had endured enough religious conflict, he suggested. Perhaps different Christian beliefs could coexist peacefully? His tolerance was partly political calculation. Lutheran ideas appealed to Danish nobility for one compelling reason: church property. The Catholic Church owned roughly 1/3 of Denmark's land. Monasteries controlled vast estates. Bishops wielded political power rivaling nobles. If Denmark adopted Lutheranism, all that property and authority would become available for redistribution. When Frederick I died in 1533, Denmark plunged into chaos. His son Christian was an open Lutheran, unacceptable to Catholic bishops and conservative nobles. They supported Christian's younger cousin. Merchants in Lübeck, the powerful German city, backed the deposed Christian Taimau, seeing opportunity in Danish instability. Armed factions prepared for civil war. What followed, called the Counts' Feud, though it involved more than counts and became more than feuding, tore Denmark apart for 3 years. Lübeck forces invaded, supposedly supporting Christian Tauffa, but actually pursuing Lübeck's commercial interests. Catholic nobles fought Protestant nobles. Peasants in some regions, seeing elite conflict, rose against all nobility. Copenhagen endured a siege lasting over a year. Christian, Frederick's Lutheran son, allied with Swedish forces under Gustav Vasa, a bitter irony given recent history. Together they defeated Lübeck's fleet and armies. By 1536, Christian III had won completely. Victory meant transformation. Christian III immediately imprisoned all Catholic bishops who opposed him. The formal charge was treason during the Civil War, but everyone understood the real reason. On October 30th, 1536, Christian declared Denmark officially Lutheran. There would be no debate, no gradual transition, no tolerance of his father's variety. The Reformation came to Denmark through royal decree backed by military force. Monasteries were dissolved, their lands confiscated and distributed to loyal nobles. Catholic rituals were prohibited. Priests could now marry. Services would be conducted in Danish, not Latin. The Bible would be translated so common Danes could read God's word themselves. Former church property enriched the crown and nobility simultaneously, creating powerful interest in maintaining the new religious order. Cathedral schools became Lutheran institutions training new clergy. The University of Copenhagen was reformed along Protestant lines. Johannes Bugenhagen, Luther's close associate, came from Germany to reorganize the Danish church completely. By 1539, the transformation was largely complete. Danish children grew up learning Lutheran catechism. Catholic Denmark, which had existed for 500 years since Harald Bluetooth's conversion, had vanished in less than a decade. Christian III ruled until 1559, consolidating Protestant authority and repairing damage from civil war. Denmark emerged religiously unified but dramatically changed. The Catholic Church's spiritual monopoly was broken, its wealth redistributed, its political influence eliminated. This religious revolution would prove permanent, shaping Danish identity for centuries. Christian III died in 1559, passing Denmark's crown to his capable but cautious son Frederick II. But when Frederick died in 1588, the throne went to his 11-year-old son Christian. Few expected greatness from this boy. Denmark would soon discover it had crowned its most ambitious, energetic, and ultimately tragic monarch. Christian IV reached adulthood during Denmark's golden age of prosperity. The sound dues those tolls charged to every ship passing between the North Sea and Baltic through the narrow strait between Denmark and Sweden filled royal coffers magnificently. Over 15,000 ships passed annually, each paying based on cargo value. Dutch merchants alone contributed 40% of these revenues. Danish income from tolls dwarfed what most European monarchies extracted from taxation. Young Christian possessed boundless energy and grand vision. Unlike previous kings content to collect revenues and maintain authority, he dreamed of transforming Denmark into a showcase of Renaissance magnificence. He would become Denmark's greatest builder. Construction began everywhere. Rosenborg Castle rose in Copenhagen, a fairy tale palace of red brick and sandstone spires where Christian himself sketched architectural details. He founded entire cities. Christiania, later called Oslo in Norway, Christianshavn, a planned merchant district in Copenhagen with Dutch-style canals, Glückstadt in Holstein. Churches, fortifications, universities, trading posts appeared across his domains. Christian personally inspected construction sites, arguing with architects, demanding perfection. The sound dues funded everything. Denmark seemed invincible, prosperous beyond measure, positioned at Europe's commercial crossroads. Christian IV appeared destined to lead Denmark into a glorious future. Then came the 30 Years' War. This catastrophic religious conflict, beginning in 1618, would devastate Central Europe and shatter Denmark's prosperity. As Protestant German princes fought Catholic imperial forces, Christian IV saw opportunity. He would defend Protestant interests, expand Danish influence southward, and perhaps capture additional German territories for his younger sons. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Christian IV led Danish armies into Germany in 1625, confident in Danish strength. Reality proved brutal. At Lutter and Barenberg in 1626, imperial forces under Count Tilly crushed the Danish army. Christian himself barely escaped, fighting desperately in the melee, losing sight in one eye from battlefield wounds. Imperial armies invaded Denmark proper, occupying Jutland. Only Swedish intervention and Christian's payment of massive indemnities secured peace. The Treaty of Lübeck in 1629 ended Danish military adventures in Germany. Christian IV had lost thousands of men, depleted Denmark's treasury, and gained nothing. Worse, Denmark's military reputation lay in ruins. Christian tried rebuilding. He promoted trade, expanded fortifications, maintained his building projects, though finances grew increasingly strained. But Sweden, Denmark's perpetual rival, sensed weakness. The Torstenson War erupted in 1643 when Swedish forces invaded without warning. Swedish General Lennart Torstensson led armies that ravaged Jutland while Swedish fleets challenged Danish naval supremacy. Christian IV, now 66 years old, commanded his flagship personally during naval combat near Kolberger Heide. Swedish cannonballs killed dozens around him. Wooden splinters from ship's railing shredded his face and body. He refused to leave the deck. Danish courage could not reverse Swedish military superiority. The Treaty of Brömsebro in 1645 cost Denmark the Baltic islands of Gotland and Ösel, Norwegian territories, and exemption from sound dues for Swedish shipping. Each concession weakened Denmark while strengthening Sweden. Christian IV died in 1648, the same year the 30 Years' War finally ended. He left magnificent architecture and a diminished kingdom. His ambition had led Denmark into disasters from which it would never fully recover. Christian IV's death left Denmark vulnerable. His son Frederick III inherited a kingdom financially exhausted and militarily humiliated. The sound dues still generated revenue, but debts from decades of warfare consumed most income. Denmark's army remained weak. Its navy, once Europe's finest, required expensive repairs. Swedish military power, meanwhile, had grown formidable through decades of victories in European wars. In 1657, Sweden struck. Charles X, Sweden's warrior king fresh from campaigns in Poland, turned his battle-hardened armies toward Denmark without warning. Swedish forces invaded from the south, overwhelming Danish defenses in Holstein and Jutland with shocking speed. Frederick III watched helplessly as town after town fell. The Danish military, undermanned and poorly equipped, could offer little resistance. Then came something unprecedented in military history. Winter arrived early that year, bringing unusually severe cold. The waters between Danish islands froze solid. Charles X saw opportunity where others saw impassable barriers. In February 1658, Swedish armies marched across the ice. 10,000 soldiers, artillery pieces, supply wagons, and cavalry crossed the frozen Little Belt, then the Great Belt, advancing straight toward Copenhagen on ice bridges 3 feet thick. Imagine witnessing this spectacle. Endless columns of enemy soldiers materializing across frozen seas, approaching through morning mist, their footsteps echoing off the ice. Danish defenders watched in horror as the impossible became reality. Sweden's armies could now reach Denmark's capital directly. Frederick III faced catastrophe. Copenhagen stood defenseless against Swedish forces positioned just miles away. No relief armies existed. No winter campaign could drive Sweden back. Denmark had no choice but capitulation. The Treaty of Roskilde, signed in March 1658, represented Denmark's most devastating territorial loss in history. Denmark surrendered Scania, the rich agricultural province forming southern Sweden today. Halland, Blekinge, and Bornholm disappeared from Danish control. Denmark lost its Norwegian territories east of the Oslofjord. The treaty stripped away roughly 1/3 of Denmark's total territory and population. These provinces had been Danish for centuries. Scania's cathedral towns, fishing villages, and farmlands had formed Denmark's heartland. Now Swedish territory separated Copenhagen from the Kattegat. Denmark's kingdom had been physically severed. Yet Charles X wanted more. The Swedish king, emboldened by success, broke the treaty within months. Swedish armies invaded again in August 1658, this time aiming to conquer Denmark entirely. Swedish forces besieged Copenhagen directly. Frederick III and Denmark's government found themselves trapped behind city walls as Swedish artillery bombarded their capital. The complete destruction of Denmark seemed inevitable. What saved Denmark came from an unexpected direction. The Dutch Republic, watching Sweden's growing Baltic dominance with alarm, recognized that Swedish control of both sides of the Sound would threaten Dutch commercial interests catastrophically. Dutch merchant fleets depended on Baltic trade. Swedish monopoly over access would be economically disastrous. Dutch warships arrived in October 1658, breaking through Swedish naval blockades to resupply Copenhagen. Dutch intervention transformed the military situation. Frederick III could hold out. Swedish forces, stretched thin and fighting multiple enemies, could no longer guarantee victory. The siege dragged through winter. Copenhagen's citizens endured bombardment, disease, and food shortages, but Dutch supplies kept the city alive. By 1660, Charles X faced the reality that crushing Denmark entirely exceeded even Swedish military capacity. The Peace of Copenhagen in May 1660 ended the war. Denmark retained its independence but confirmed the territorial losses from Roskilde. Bornholm returned to Danish control after its population revolted against Swedish occupation. But Scania, Halland, and Blekinge remained Swedish forever. Denmark had survived as an independent kingdom, but barely. The loss of Scania particularly haunted Danish consciousness. The question that tormented every Dane was simple. Could Denmark survive as a great power when Sweden now commanded such overwhelming military superiority? The crisis of 1660 had revealed the fatal weakness of Denmark's political system. The nobility controlled the Council of the Realm, which severely limited royal authority. These aristocrats had jealously guarded their privileges, refusing to contribute taxes while demanding expensive wars that drained the kingdom's resources. Denmark's military catastrophe stemmed directly from this dysfunctional governance. Common citizens and the urban bourgeoisie recognized this truth clearly. The traditional power structure had failed spectacularly. Frederick III understood the moment had arrived for transformation. In September 1660, the king summoned representatives from all estates to Copenhagen. Nobles, Clergy and commoners gathered expecting traditional negotiations about taxation. Instead, they witnessed revolution. The clergy and burgher estates, supported by Copenhagen's armed citizenry, formally renounced the nobles' political supremacy. They offered Frederick absolute sovereignty, free from aristocratic constraints. The Council of the Realm dissolved itself. Centuries of noble privilege ended in days. Frederick III became Europe's most powerful absolute monarch, his authority unlimited by law or tradition. Unlike other European kings who claimed divine right through custom, Frederick's absolutism received explicit legal foundation. The Royal Law of 1665 formalized this transformation. This remarkable document created Europe's first written absolutist constitution. The law declared Denmark's monarchy hereditary and indivisible. The king answered to God alone. No council, parliament, or estate could challenge royal decisions. The monarch controlled military appointments, foreign policy, legislation, and taxation completely. Denmark's nobility retained their estates but lost political power entirely. Frederick rebuilt Denmark's shattered institutions systematically. He constructed a modern military establishment with standardized training and equipment. Professional bureaucrats replaced noble administrators. Tax collection became efficient and predictable. Denmark's government transformed from feudal chaos into organized autocracy. His son Christian V continued this consolidation. The Great Northern War erupted in 1700 when Denmark allied with Russia and Poland against Swedish dominance. Danish forces invaded Scania, attempting to recover the lost provinces. Initial campaigns showed promise, but Swedish military skill proved superior. By 1721, Denmark accepted that Scania would remain Swedish permanently. However, Sweden's era of Baltic dominance had ended. Russia emerged as the region's new superpower. Christian VI, crowned in 1730, brought different priorities. Intensely pious, he transformed court culture completely. Hunting, theater, and elaborate ceremonies gave way to prayer meetings and religious study. His reign imposed strict Lutheran pietism throughout Denmark. Church attendance became mandatory. Moral regulations governed daily behavior minutely. Yet Christian VI also understood grandeur. Copenhagen still lacked a palace matching European standards. Between 1733 and 1745, Christian constructed Christiansborg Palace on Slotsholmen Island, an enormous Baroque complex dominating Copenhagen's skyline. This building housed the absolute monarch's government, symbolizing centralized royal power physically. By 1746, Denmark had fundamentally transformed. The chaotic, weak kingdom of 1657 had become a tightly organized absolutist state. The king's authority faced no institutional limits. Professional administrators governed efficiently. Denmark had lost its great power status permanently, but survived as an independent kingdom under history's most legally defined autocracy. Frederick V inherited absolute power in 1746, but showed little interest in wielding it. Unlike his austere father, the new king preferred wine, women, and theatrical entertainments to governance. He delegated administration to capable ministers while indulging in pleasures his father had forbidden. The court transformed overnight from pious restraint to lavish excess. Copenhagen's elite welcomed this change enthusiastically. Yet Frederick's reign witnessed genuine accomplishment despite royal indifference. His ministers founded the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts, established the porcelain manufactory, and patronized architects who gave Copenhagen its elegant neoclassical character. Foreign policy remained cautious and neutral. Denmark avoided the 7 Years' War entirely, allowing commerce to flourish while continental powers exhausted themselves. Frederick's death in 1766 placed his 17-year-old son Christian VI upon the throne. Court observers immediately recognized something deeply wrong. The young king exhibited bizarre behaviors, violent mood swings, paranoid delusions, sudden rages followed by childish giggling. He believed enemies surrounded him constantly. During council meetings, he would abruptly flee or collapse into incomprehensible babbling. Modern historians diagnose schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder. 18th century Danes simply knew their king was mad. Into this crisis stepped Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German physician from Altona. Charming, educated, and steeped in Enlightenment philosophy, Struensee gained appointment as the king's personal doctor in 1768. He calmed Christian's episodes, gained his complete trust, and gradually assumed real power. Within 2 years, Struensee effectively ruled Denmark. His reforms arrived like lightning. Between 1770 and 1772, Struensee issued over 1,000 cabinet orders. He abolished torture, ended press censorship, reformed the bloated court bureaucracy, removed trade restrictions, and attacked noble privileges systematically. Denmark's government modernized almost overnight according to rational Enlightenment principles. Conservative Danes watched in horror as their traditions dissolved. Struensee's personal life proved equally radical. He conducted an increasingly open affair with Queen Caroline Mathilde, Christian's beautiful English-born wife. The king, lost in madness, barely noticed. Caroline bore Struensee a daughter in 1771. Copenhagen society buzzed with scandals about the German upstart who ruled Denmark and bedded its queen. Conservative forces coalesced around Dowager Queen Juliane Marie, Christian's stepmother, and her son, Prince Frederick. They watched Struensee's reforms destroy traditional hierarchies while his arrogance alienated potential allies. The commoner physician had moved too fast, offended too many, and displayed too little political wisdom. On January 17, 1772, conspirators struck. Armed soldiers arrested Struensee and the Queen during the night. Christian VI, manipulated by his stepmother, signed whatever documents they placed before him. Struensee faced charges of usurping royal authority and dishonoring the Queen. The trial lasted weeks. Struensee, tortured and broken, confessed everything. On April 28, 1772, executioners led him to Copenhagen's scaffold. They chopped off his right hand, then beheaded and quartered him. His body parts displayed throughout the city warned against challenging Denmark's established order. Caroline Mathilde received exile to Celle in Germany, where she died 3 years later, aged 23. Denmark's brief enlightenment ended brutally. The conservative reaction following Struensee's execution brought Prince Frederick to power as regent for his mentally incapacitated half-brother. But Frederick proved surprisingly progressive himself. Between 1784 and 1800, he oversaw Denmark's agricultural revolution, transforming the kingdom's economic foundation more peacefully than Struensee's frantic reforms ever could. The great agricultural reforms of 1788 freed Denmark's peasants from centuries of feudal bondage. Compulsory labor services ended. Common lands were enclosed and redistributed. Peasants gained the right to own farms, move freely, and educate their children. Within a generation, Denmark's countryside shifted from medieval serfdom to modern farming. Small independent farmers replaced the old manor system. Agricultural productivity soared as newly motivated landowners adopted scientific methods and crop rotation. Copenhagen flourished on this agricultural prosperity. The city's population swelled. Merchants grew wealthy trading Danish grain throughout Europe. The navy expanded to protect commerce. For nearly 2 decades, Denmark maintained profitable neutrality while revolutionary France and monarchist coalitions tore the continent apart. Then, British warships appeared off Copenhagen in April 1801. Britain demanded Denmark close the Baltic to French shipping and surrender its fleet for British control. The demand was impossible. Denmark's neutrality was its lifeline, and the fleet represented national survival in a dangerous age. When Danish guns refused British demands, Admiral Horatio Nelson led his squadron into Copenhagen harbor on April 2nd. The Battle of Copenhagen raged for 4 hours. Danish shore batteries and floating fortresses fought desperately against superior British naval power. Nelson famously put his telescope to his blind eye when signals ordered retreat, declaring he saw no such command. By afternoon, Danish defenses crumbled. Crown Prince Frederik, now effectively ruling Denmark, negotiated armistice to prevent total annihilation. Denmark agreed to suspend its alliance with Russia while maintaining official neutrality. The British departed, leaving Copenhagen's harbor smoldering. 6 years later, they returned with different intentions. Napoleon dominated Europe by 1807. Britain stood alone against French hegemony. When rumors suggested Napoleon would seize the Danish fleet for an invasion of England, the British cabinet decided on preventive action. In September 1807, a massive British force surrounded Copenhagen. General Cathcart commanded 20,000 troops. Admiral Gambier's fleet sealed the harbor. The British demanded Denmark surrender its entire navy immediately. Crown Prince Frederik, having moved the government from occupied Copenhagen to Kiel, refused. On September 2nd, British bombardment commenced. For 3 nights, mortars rained firebombs on Copenhagen. Congreve rockets, terrifying new weapons, screamed into residential neighborhoods. The city burned. Thousands of civilians died. Churches, hospitals, and homes collapsed into rubble. After 1,800 civilian deaths, Copenhagen surrendered on September 7th. British forces seized Denmark's entire fleet, 70 ships, including 18 ships of the line, and sailed away with their prize. The bombardment traumatized Denmark and destroyed any pretense of neutrality. Frederik had no choice but alliance with Napoleon. From 1807 to 1814, Denmark fought Britain across the North Atlantic. Norwegian timber supplied the French war machine. Danish privateers harassed British shipping. Britain retaliated with total naval blockade, strangling Denmark's economy. The continental system's collapse brought catastrophe. Denmark's currency spiraled into worthless inflation. The state treasury declared bankruptcy in 1813. When Napoleon fell in 1814, Denmark faced a victor's settlement with nothing to bargain. The Treaty of Kiel, signed January 14, 1814, severed Norway from Denmark after 4 centuries of union. Sweden, having abandoned Napoleon early, claimed Norway as reward. Denmark retained only the old North Atlantic possessions: Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands. 3 decades after the agricultural revolution promised prosperity, Denmark emerged from the Napoleonic Wars bankrupted, bombarded, and broken. The Treaty of Kiel left Denmark smaller and poorer than it had been for centuries. Yet something remarkable happened in the decades following national catastrophe. As the kingdom's political power contracted, its cultural influence expanded in ways no one could have predicted. The economic depression of the 1820s and 30s crushed ordinary Danes. State bankruptcy meant worthless currency and collapsed trade. Peasant farmers who had gained freedom 40 years earlier now struggled to survive on their small holdings. Copenhagen's population faced unemployment and hunger. The government limped along, barely maintaining basic functions. But in this darkness, Denmark discovered its soul. Hans Christian Andersen published his first collection of fairy tales in 1835. The son of an Odense washerwoman and a shoemaker, Andersen seemed an unlikely candidate for literary immortality. Yet his stories, The Little Mermaid, The Ugly Duckling, The Emperor's New Clothes, captured universal human truths in deceptively simple tales. Within a decade, translations spread across Europe. Here was Denmark speaking to the world again, not through military might or political power, but through imagination and emotional honesty. Copenhagen's cafes buzzed with philosophical debate. In 1843, a melancholic young thinker named Søren Kierkegaard published Either Slash, or launching modern existentialism into European thought. His relentless examination of individual choice, faith, and authenticity challenged both religious orthodoxy and emerging rationalist philosophy. Kierkegaard wrote in Danish for Danes, yet his ideas would echo through 20th century philosophy worldwide. The sculptor Bertel Thorvaldsen returned triumphantly to Copenhagen in 1838 after 4 decades conquering Rome's art world. His neoclassical sculptures rivaled anything since Michelangelo. When his ship entered Copenhagen harbor, crowds lined the waterfront to welcome home their conquering hero, not a military general, but an artist. Meanwhile, a country pastor named NFS Grundtvig was revolutionizing Danish education and national identity. Grundtvig rejected elite Latin schooling and classical education models. Instead, he championed folk high schools where ordinary Danes could gather for shared learning, democratic discussion, and cultural education. His first folk high school opened in 1844 at Reading, teaching Danish history, literature, and practical knowledge in Danish, not Latin or German. This movement, combining democratic ideals with cultural revival, crystallized into national romanticism. Danes began rediscovering their Viking heritage, celebrating medieval sagas, and asserting their distinct identity against German cultural dominance. Artists painted dramatic Nordic landscapes. Poets revived old ballads. Historians excavated Denmark's ancient glory. This cultural awakening carried political implications, particularly regarding Schleswig and Holstein. These southern duchies had mixed Danish and German populations. As German nationalism intensified across the fragmented Germanic states, Schleswig-Holstein became a flashpoint. Were these territories Danish or German? Could they be separated? The question simmered through the 1840s as both Danish and German nationalists sharpened their claims. Denmark emerged from its golden age culturally transformed but politically vulnerable. The kingdom that had lost Norway now faced potentially losing its southern borderlands too. The winds of revolution swept across Europe in the spring of 1848. Paris erupted first, overthrowing King Louis Philippe. Within weeks, Vienna, Berlin, and dozens of other cities saw barricades in the streets and monarchs fleeing their palaces. The old order, established after Napoleon's defeat, was collapsing. Copenhagen felt the tremors. On March 21st, 15,000 citizens gathered peacefully outside King Frederick VII's palace. No violence occurred. No blood stained the cobblestones. The crowd simply demanded an end to absolutism. Frederick, a hard-drinking, troubled man who had little appetite for absolute power anyway, capitulated immediately. Within hours, he promised Denmark a constitution. What had taken centuries of civil war to achieve in England happened in Denmark during an afternoon. Yet immediately, the Schleswig-Holstein question exploded. German nationalists in Holstein declared independence, demanding both duchies unite with the emerging German Confederation. Danish nationalists insisted Schleswig belonged to Denmark. Frederick's government mobilized troops, sparking the First Schleswig War. Danish forces initially struggled against the better-equipped German rebels and their Prussian allies. But the war remained limited. European powers, particularly Britain and Russia, pressured Prussia to withdraw. The London Protocol of 1852 confirmed Danish sovereignty over the duchies, though it left underlying tensions unresolved. The Constitution Drafting Committee worked through 1848 and 49. The National Assembly gathered at Eidsvoll Palace, representing a broader cross-section of Danish society than had ever held political power. Farmers sat alongside merchants, academics alongside artisans. Arguments raged over voting rights, the role of the monarch, and the balance between legislative and executive power. The June Constitution, signed on June 5, 1849, created a constitutional monarchy with a two-chamber parliament. All men over 30 could vote, revolutionary for its time. The king retained executive power and could veto legislation, but he could no longer rule by decree. Denmark had transformed itself, remarkably peacefully, from absolute monarchy to constitutional democracy. The 1850s brought relative stability. The economy gradually recovered. Grundtvigsfolk high schools spread across the countryside, creating informed citizens for the new democracy. Agriculture modernized. Copenhagen expanded. Denmark seemed to be successfully navigating the transition to modern statehood. But the Schleswig-Holstein question festered. Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian minister-president, saw opportunity. He wanted to unite German states under Prussian leadership and needed military victories to achieve it. Denmark's southern duchies offered the perfect target. Danish nationalists, drunk on constitutional success and cultural confidence, made a fatal miscalculation. In November 1863, Denmark's new king Christian IX signed a constitution integrating Schleswig more tightly into the kingdom, a direct violation of earlier international agreements. The move was politically popular domestically but diplomatically catastrophic. Bismarck pounced. He secured Austrian alliance and manufactured justification for invasion. In February 1864, Prussian and Austrian forces, vastly outnumbering Danish troops, crossed the border. The Second Schleswig War became Denmark's Alamo. At Dibble, overlooking the Alsound, Danish soldiers held earthwork fortifications against overwhelming Prussian artillery. For months, they endured bombardment. On April 18th, after 7 hours of concentrated shelling, Prussian forces stormed the positions. The battle lasted mere hours. Danish casualties exceeded 1,000 killed or wounded. Denmark fought on desperately, but the outcome was inevitable. Superior Prussian numbers, artillery, and organization crushed Danish resistance. By October, Denmark sued for peace. The Treaty of Vienna stripped Denmark of Schleswig, Holstein, and Lauenburg, 40% of Danish territory and 35% of its population. More than 200,000 Danish speakers in northern Schleswig found themselves under German rule. The trauma cut deep into Danish consciousness. The 1864 defeat fundamentally reshaped Danish national identity. Military glory was finished. The old dreams of Scandinavian union evaporated. Instead, Denmark would turn inward, discovering a new purpose in the decades ahead, transforming loss into something unexpected. In the smoking ruins of military defeat, a Danish pastor named Enrico Dalgas surveyed the windswept heathlands of Jutland and saw opportunity. What was lost without must be won within, he declared, coining the phrase that would define Denmark's transformation. The Heath Society, which he founded in 1866, began the systematic conversion of Jutland's barren moors into productive farmland. Thousands of volunteers planted trees, dug drainage channels, and transformed landscapes that had remained unchanged since the Bronze Age. The work was backbreaking. Teams of laborers spent years constructing networks of ditches to channel water from the soggy heath. They planted pine forests that would take decades to mature. Between 1866 and 1900, the Heath Society reclaimed nearly 1 million acres of previously useless land. Scattered farms appeared where only scrub grass had grown. New villages sprouted. This internal colonization offered defeated Denmark something military conquest never could: genuine expansion of its productive capacity. But physical land reclamation told only half the story. Danish farmers, facing fierce competition from cheap American grain flooding European markets, needed organizational innovation to survive. The cooperative movement provided the answer. The first dairy cooperative opened in 1882 in the village of Jetting. Rather than each farmer attempting to process and market milk individually, neighbors pooled resources. They shared equipment, divided labor, and marketed collectively. The cooperative structure ensured democratic control. One member, one vote, regardless of farm size. Profits returned to members proportional to their contributions. The model spread with astonishing speed. Within a decade, Hundreds of dairy cooperatives dotted the countryside. Bacon cooperatives followed, then egg cooperatives. Danish butter and bacon, standardized through cooperative quality controls, became premium brands across Europe. Small farmers, who might have been crushed by modernization, instead thrived through collective action. By 1900, Denmark exported more butter per capita than any nation on Earth. This economic transformation occurred alongside constitutional evolution. The 1849 Constitution had created parliamentary institutions, but the king still appointed ministers. Through the 1880s and 90s, a fundamental question festered. Should the government reflect the will of the elected parliament, or could the monarch simply choose whomever he preferred? The Liberal Party, representing farmers and rural interests, dominated parliamentary elections. Yet conservative kings repeatedly appointed ministers from the minority Conservative Party, which represented landowners and urban elites. Political deadlock paralyzed government. Liberals blocked budgets. Conservatives ruled by provisional decrees. Danish democracy seemed broken. The crisis climaxed in 1901. The Liberal Party won yet another overwhelming electoral victory. This time, King Christian IX finally conceded. He appointed a liberal government that actually reflected parliamentary majority. The principle of parliamentarism, that governments must command legislative support, was established without revolution, coup, or violence. The new liberal governments immediately pursued social reform. Factory inspection laws protected workers from the most egregious industrial abuses. Housing regulations improved urban living conditions. The beginnings of old age pensions emerged. These reforms remained modest compared to later welfare state developments, but they marked a fundamental shift. The state accepting responsibility for citizen well-being. Trade unions grew stronger. Strikes occasionally paralyzed Copenhagen's harbor. Workers organized. Employers organized in response. The September Compromise of 1899 established frameworks for labor negotiation, avoiding the violent class conflicts tearing apart other industrializing nations. Denmark entered the 20th century transformed utterly from the defeated kingdom of 1864. Military glory was forgotten. Instead, the nation had discovered power in cooperation, democracy, and internal development. The marshes were drained. The farms thrived. The government answered to its people. War was coming to Europe again, but Denmark had learned different lessons about survival. When war erupted across Europe in August 1914, Denmark faced a terrible dilemma. Germany bordered its south. Britain controlled the seas. Russia loomed to the east. Any alliance meant potential devastation. Prime Minister Karl Theodor Zolli made the only sensible choice: absolute neutrality. The decision proved remarkably profitable. Danish farmers supplied both sides with butter, bacon, and beef. Shipping companies charged premium rates to navigate wartime hazards. Copenhagen's banks facilitated international transactions when normal financial channels collapsed. While millions died in muddy trenches, Denmark grew wealthy from their hunger. But neutrality demanded constant vigilance. German submarines prowled Danish waters. British warships stopped and searched merchant vessels. Denmark mined its own harbors to prevent violation. The government walked a diplomatic tightrope, offending neither side fatally while trading with both shamelessly. When armistice finally arrived in November 1918, Denmark emerged physically unscathed and economically enriched. Victory brought unexpected opportunity. The Treaty of Versailles mandated a plebiscite in Schleswig, the territory lost so bitterly in 1864. Would the population choose Denmark or Germany? In February 1920, voters in North Schleswig overwhelmingly selected reunion with Denmark. In South Schleswig, they chose Germany. On June 15th, King Christian X rode his white horse across the new border at Kongen. Thousands cheered. The wound was partially healed. The interwar decades brought democratic deepening. Social democratic governments expanded welfare provisions. Unemployment insurance protected workers. Healthcare improved. The cooperative movement continued its steady expansion. Denmark seemed to have found a peaceful path toward prosperity and equality. Then came April 9th, 1940. At 4:15 in the morning, German bombers appeared over Copenhagen. Paratroopers seized key airfields. Armored columns rolled across the southern border. German warships steamed into Danish harbors. The invasion was overwhelming, coordinated, and utterly unstoppable. Denmark's tiny army mobilized, but within hours, King Christian and the government faced reality. Resistance meant Copenhagen's destruction and thousands of civilian deaths. By 9:30 that morning, Denmark had surrendered. The entire operation lasted 6 hours. Not since the Middle Ages had a kingdom fallen so quickly. Yet what followed proved far more complex than simple conquest. Germany offered Denmark unusual terms. The government could remain in office. The king stayed on his throne. Parliament continued meeting. The army kept its weapons. In exchange, Denmark would accommodate German military needs and supply food for the Reich. It was occupation wrapped in the fiction of independence. For 3 years, this cooperation policy functioned. Danish politicians convinced themselves they were protecting citizens from worse alternatives. They prevented full Nazi takeover. They maintained domestic order. They preserved Danish institutions. But the moral compromise grew increasingly unbearable. Denmark supplied food while Europe starved. Danish workers built fortifications for the Wehrmacht. The government existed at Nazi sufferance. Popular patience snapped in August 1943. Strikes paralyzed Copenhagen. Saboteurs attacked German installations. Wehrmacht officers delivered an ultimatum: restore order or face military administration. The Danish government refused to suppress its own people. On August 29, the Germans dissolved the government and imposed direct military rule. That same night, a Danish civil servant named Georg Ferdinand Duckwitz made a fateful choice. He learned that Nazi forces planned to deport Denmark's 7,800 Jews to concentration camps. Duckwitz leaked the information to Danish resistance leaders. What followed became Denmark's finest hour in its darkest moment. In 3 desperate weeks during October 1943, the Danish resistance organized an unprecedented evacuation. Fishing boats carried Jewish families across the narrow sound to neutral Sweden. The operation involved thousands: fishermen, clergy, doctors, ordinary citizens who hid refugees until boats departed. 7,200 Jews escaped the Nazi dragnet. Nearly 95% of Denmark's Jewish population reached safety. When German forces swept through Jewish neighborhoods, they found empty apartments and locked synagogues. The rescue stood as a remarkable moment of collective moral courage in an era defined by collaboration and complicity. Liberation came on May 5, 1945. British forces crossed the German border into Denmark as Wehrmacht units began surrendering. In Copenhagen, jubilant crowds poured into streets draped with red and white Dannebrog flags hidden since 1940. King Christian appeared on his palace balcony, tears streaming down his face. 5 years of occupation had ended. Post-war Denmark faced stark choices about its future. The catastrophe of April 9th had exposed the fantasy of neutrality between great powers. Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe transformed the strategic landscape. When Western nations formed NATO in 1949, Denmark joined. The decision marked a fundamental shift. Denmark explicitly aligned itself with the Western Bloc, abandoning centuries of carefully maintained neutrality. Yet Denmark's commitment remained measured. When NATO members considered nuclear weapons deployment in the 1950s, Danish politicians refused permission for peacetime storage on Danish soil. The policy reflected a characteristically Danish approach. Membership, yes, but with careful boundaries and constant negotiation. The economic miracle that swept Western Europe touched Denmark profoundly. Marshall Plan aid financed reconstruction. New industries emerged. Employment reached historic highs. But Denmark didn't simply pursue capitalist growth. It constructed something distinctly different. Between 1945 and 1970, Danish governments built the comprehensive welfare state that defines the nation today. Free healthcare covered every citizen from cradle to grave. Public education through university cost nothing. Generous unemployment benefits protected workers between jobs. Parental leave extended months. The elderly received dignified pensions. Child allowances helped families with young children. How was this funded? Through some of the world's highest taxation rates. Income taxes reached 50% for middle earners, higher for the wealthy. Value-added taxes increased the cost of consumer goods. Yet, remarkably, most Danes accepted the bargain. They could see where their taxes went: into schools, hospitals, parks, and social services. This was the Danish model. High taxes funding universal benefits created a society with minimal poverty, excellent health outcomes, and remarkable social mobility. A child born to a factory worker could realistically become a doctor, engineer, or entrepreneur. Education, not inheritance, determined opportunity. Denmark joined the European Economic Community in 1973, following Britain's entry. The decision reflected pragmatic economics. Access to European markets mattered more than romantic notions of Nordic isolation. Yet Danes maintained characteristic skepticism about deeper political integration, later rejecting the Maastricht Treaty in 1992 before accepting a modified version. The oil shocks of the 1970s hit Denmark hard, exposing dependence on imported petroleum. The response was characteristically practical: massive investment in wind power, combined heating and electricity systems, and energy efficiency. By the 21st century, Denmark led global renewable energy development. Modern Denmark grapples with challenges its post-war architects never imagined. Immigration from Muslim-majority countries sparked intense debates about national identity, integration, and cultural values. The comfortable homogeneity that undergirded the welfare consensus faced new complexity. Yet Denmark consistently ranks among the world's happiest nations. Why? Scholars point to the welfare state's security, high social trust, work-life balance, and that untranslatable Danish concept, hygge, the cozy contentment of intimate gatherings in a cold climate. From Viking raids to welfare state, Denmark's journey reflects persistent themes: adaptability, pragmatism, and community solidarity. The nation that once terrorized Europe now exports happiness, renewable energy, and pharmaceutical innovations. Not a bad transformation across 11 centuries. Denmark's transformation from Viking terror to global happiness leader proves that nations can fundamentally reinvent themselves. Subscribe to explore more stories of how history shapes our modern world.